So maybe we should have got a bigger room, but lovely to see so many people here. So thank you for coming. I think we're going to have quite an interesting discussion. It's broad, but we are fortunate to have a great panel. And I thought that with such an array of experience and thinkers, we should make the best of them. So in any case, my name is Mark Dempsey. I'm the EU Advocacy Lead for Article 19. For those who don't know Article 19, we're a non-profit that promotes freedom of expression and access to information globally. We have offices in London, is our HQ, and then we have a European HQ in Amsterdam. So before I introduce the content to be addressed and the speakers, a quick word on format and timings. Each speaker has 5 to 8 minutes to make some opening remarks. We will then have about 20 minutes of conversation between the panelists, and finally about 25 minutes of Q&A from yourselves. So what are we discussing today? Any AI governance framework should have human rights and freedom of expression at its core. The misapplication or anything but careful application of AI is a potential problem. It may be that it will be considered a human rights violation not to use AI in the near future, as it already is for using dumb rather than smart bombs around civilian populations. Article 19 has identified 3 main reasons often given for the banning of specific technologies or use cases for red lines. 1, inaccuracies in performance. 2, inherent, unnecessary, or disproportionate risks to human rights which cannot be mitigated. And 3, the exacerbation of power imbalances between institutions using biometrics on individuals. Furthermore, a lot of necessary and useful transparency can be provided, and it should not be controversial for the provider and our deployer to be held liable for negligence if such transparency is not provided. There is, though, a pressing need at this stage for a shared understanding of minimum standards of transparency and accountability, and which satisfy the tests of legality and due process. So now to our first speaker, Joanna Bryson, who is going to set the scene, but not before an introduction. So Joanna is Professor of Ethics and Technology at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. She is an academic recognized for broad expertise in intelligence, its nature, and its consequences, and holds 2 degrees each in psychology and AI. A BA from Chicago, an MSc and MPhil from Edinburgh, and a PhD from MIT. Prior to Hertie, she was at the Computer Science faculty at the University of Bath from 2002 to 2019, and has also been affiliated with Harvard Psychology, Oxford Anthropology, the Mannheim Center for Social Science and Research, the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, and the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy. Joanna advises governments, corporations, and NGOs globally, particularly on AI policy. Her research has appeared in venues ranging from Reddit to Science, and presently focuses on the impacts of technology on human societies and cooperation, and improving governance of AI and digital technology. I think it's necessary to give a context by giving an almost full biography, just so you know the expertise we have in the room. So Joanna, over to you.
All right, well, thanks. What do I want to say? Well, I'm going to talk about rights, which, I didn't know that much before I came to a governance school. It's a great thing to go to governance school. I feel like I have a new PhD, so I'm going to do that first. Then I'm going to talk briefly about the EU's approach, not because, everyone should be governed by the EU, but rather because it's a thing that's there that we can talk about. And then I'll talk about the wider picture. So quickly, it used to be when people talked about government, they sort of had this discussion where, someone turns up on a sword on a horse, and says, okay, you guys, I'm providing you safety here, and you're now going to give me some tax, right? There was some kind of random, slight, one-sided agreement or non-agreement, anyway, some kind of binding obligations. But then in the 18th century, there started to be this new theory that rights were something that were discoverable, and governments had obligations. So we hold these truths self-evident, right? The U.S. Declaration of Independence came out of, some Enlightenment theory, right? Now, interestingly, this means that people are passively entitled to these things, and that rights are these discoverable truths. You might notice from my accent, I sound American. The American rights named this way are negative rights, which means the government doesn't do stuff. It doesn't do things to you. And you can have infinite numbers of those. Governments can do nothing. That's fine, right? But the modern rights from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights exist in tension, right? There's this problem where they cost money to enforce, And so suddenly you can have things that are fundamental rights, but that a government can't afford, right? They can't both give you housing and give you food and give you the ultimate health care, something like that. So another theory that's come up, sorry about this, I normally use my own laptop. There we go. So another framing is that instead of thinking of residents of countries, and I'm using residents, not citizens, because again, I don't want to get into the argument about who's a citizen. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says everyone within the borders of a country is the obligation of that country's government to defend their rights. So the residents of a region here are now constituting their states, and we use the governments to coordinate us having an easier time governing our families and our companies, right? And that's really interesting because it kind of gets away from this idea that rights are discoverable. Now you can understand things like why in COVID you had less freedom of movement, because there were these tensions and they had to trade off, right? And I like it also because it's a less adversarial model of government. It drives me insane that companies think, like, don't regulate us, don't regulate us. We're up-regulating you. We're pouring money into the digital economy. Why are you so, like, against the thing that the hands that are feeding you, right? So anyway, this is the AI-related regulation in the EU. You can see there's dozens of acts. And so when Mark says that, that fundamental rights have to be at the core, fundamental rights are at the core of the EU project, right? It's already expressed in the contracts, And so all these other things are on top of it, and they don't each have to have something about electricity production, sustainability, fundamental rights. And as someone who was involved in this advisory process for years, I'm just really shocked by some of the things that were shoehorned or attempted to be shoehorned in the last year. But that's just talking about the AI Act. I actually think that the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Acts are far more important for the rights I was more worried about in terms of infringement. So what are these things? Of course, the General Data Protection Regulation underlies everything, and that's the thing that really talks about the rights of people not to be manipulated, right? It became the obligation of governments to defend personal data, just like it became the government, when there was AI. Just like it became the obligation of governments to defend their airspace because of the innovation of rockets and airplanes, right? So that's why we have to do this. Sitting on top of that is the Digital Services Act, which is about profiling, recommendation systems, and targeted advertisements. Basically the things that were implicated in Brexit, right? It's no longer that you can create general, on-the-fly advertisements, picking out personality traits of people from their social media interactions and trying to exploit them, and then not even leave a record, which is what happened after Brexit. They didn't even keep the standard records you would expect to have of political advertisement that was legally obliged to have. Okay, so basically you can think of the DSA as checking like a whole bunch of infrastructure to really check that the GDPR is being correctly applied. All right, the DMA is another really important thing. I won't go into detail here, but basically it's about what do you do with really large companies, which for some reason their home country is no longer enforcing antitrust against. So that's where we handle the really big companies. We have special negotiating. It goes up and down. It's super interesting. Article 19 does a lot of work in this area too. And then finally, the AI Act was supposed to be actually pretty boring, but this is so essential. As was just mentioned by Mark, it is so essential that people understand that digital products are products, and that you're negligent if you can't demonstrate you've done due diligence. People keep saying, how can we possibly keep up with legislation as AI changes so fast? We don't have to keep up. We just have to enforce what is due diligence, what is best practice, right? The sectors themselves are the ones that witness this on the witness stands or write about it in their trade journals. And then the government is only an enforcer. Again, I don't want to name which big tech, but I had a big tech that was just like, you don't understand how much effort we have to expend stopping other people in our sector from racing to the bottom. And I'm like, that is what the government is for, right? Cooperate on the legislation and then throw that problem over the wall. When you detect something happening in your sector that's not okay, get the government to enforce, right? Okay, so there was a beautiful thing that was done by the UNESCO years. Again, I love process. People spent years on the AI Act, but they spent more countries spent more years on this. It's beautiful. It's like an extension of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I really strongly recommend you read it. It's just great. It bothers me that, well, again, the U.S. actually wasn't involved. It was the only country not involved because Trump had, or somebody had pulled them out of the UNESCO right then. There's a lot of efforts right now to pretend that generative AI is the only AI, and that and to sort of distract from all the work that we've done. As I mentioned, what I was concerned about, one of the things I was concerned about was Brexit. One of the things I was concerned about was people replacing large numbers of humans' eyes with a small number of cameras in a single algorithm, which is an easily hackable, easily attackable kind of situation, right? Subject either to opponents, antagonistic opponents, or to indeed corruption. And you can find, if you're on LinkedIn with me or whatever, if you look at my blog, you can find me telling Eric Schmidt that that was what I was worried about when he was talking about saving the valuable eyes of the military. And I think this is a very good description of what we saw in last October as well. So this is what I worry about when I worry about AI ethics, and I will skip this. This is just basically saying I don't think we should have a single jurisdiction because of regulatory capture. I think we need to have maybe 10 or 12 models, and I'm agreeing with Birthday Boy Kant on that. I don't want a global government. I don't want a global AI regulation. I do want jurisdictions that have enough heft, which is what the EU has done. And I'd like to see the whole world protected by something that's along the lines of the EU, or, of course, their own country, like for China and India and the US. Okay, thanks. Was that 8 minutes?
Yeah, that wasn't even 8 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Shauna. Yeah, totally agree on the need to remove the focus on generative AI, and curious to hear about the multiple jurisdictions. But first, our next, today we're going to go on to Sarah Chander. Again, another household name in this space, both in Brussels and afar. Sarah is known for her pioneering work on the AI Act as a senior policy advisor for the European Digital Rights, EDRI, and its network of over 50 civil society organizations. During the legislative process of the AI Act, Sarah and EDRI mobilized a coalition of 150 lawyers, activists, academics, and CSOs to demand greater transparency through publicly available databases about how systems are used, as well as a legal framework for those directly affected. As of February this year, Sarah is director and co-founder of Equinox, a racial justice initiative, a people of colour-led organisation working to advance justice for radicalised people in Europe. Equinox works in solidarity with racialised and marginalised communities to build power with a specific focus on migration, policing, gender, digital, environmental policy. Sarah.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. Before I jump into my speech about the AI Act, which Joanna says should have been very boring, and I'm happy to say that it isn't, at least a little bit. But before I do that, I would just say I'm only here today because the CPDP conference dropped its partnership with the Haifa Center for Law and Technology. Based in Israel, we are in day 228 of Israel's genocidal onslaught on Gaza. Tens of thousands of people have been murdered. And it is the role of AI companies, security companies across the globe that have played a role in that. And Daniel will talk a little bit about that later. So before I talk about the speech, I would just like to say I think there is a point of what we're all talking about here today, human rights in the face of AI, in the digital economy. It is a responsibility of this community not to let digital rights issues whitewash genocide, and to hold our communities, our spaces, our institutions to account for their participation, whether that be financial or ideological, in human rights abuses, genocide, war crimes across the world. So, with that being said, we're talking about the AI Act. There's a mixture of people in this room. Can you just give me a raise of the hands? How many of you feel comfortable with the AI Act? How much do you know about it? Do you feel comfortable with the text? Do you know everything about it? Or tell me if you feel comfortable with that text. You know everything there. Not that many people.
Those are two different things.
Okay. Do you understand it, maybe, is the question. Tell me who understands it really well. Carolina over there, yes, very well. Okay. Let's just a little marker of how we're going to phrase our introductions then, because it is a very technical piece of legislation. As Joanna said, it sits on top of many other pieces of legislation, and I think there are about over 100 articles in that text as well. So when we're trying to understand that, yeah, we also need to be a bit simpler also as us, as panelists, to bring everyone into that conversation. So I would like to talk very briefly, a few learnings of the AI Act as people alongside Daniel and many other people who advocated on this piece of legislation. We as civil society advocated for three main things. One, a series of prohibitions on the most harmful uses of technology that we thought were unacceptable, that if they were implemented would not uphold fundamental rights, they would harm people irrevocably, and needed to be prevented instead of improved. We argued that there are some AI uses that are too harmful to communities, to people, to ever be allowed, and therefore we needed a prohibition to prevent harm, rather than a legal framework that requires the affected people to eradicate harm after the fact. As we've seen with many AI-based scandals, predictive policing across the world, the Netherlands child benefit scandal, etc. Let's not let AI systems ruin people's lives and then ask people to do activism against it. That was the first thing. The second thing we asked for was a framework of transparency and accountability for the for all. We asked for transparency and accountability for all AI uses. And what we got was a framework of measures which created, in effect, a bureaucracy for AI deployers and AI developers that were developing only high-risk systems. So that includes things like a fundamental rights impact assessment, so governments or companies who are using high-risk systems to provide some public information about how those systems would impact you and I, what would be the specific impacts on marginalized communities, and tell us when and where you're using those systems. That's what we asked for. The last thing was that we asked for people affected and public interest organizations to be able to challenge the use of these systems. So if a rights violation had happened or a system in some other way was harmful, violating fundamental rights, we asked for a framework by which people could contest those systems. Those are the three things we asked for. We didn't get all of those things, but we got some of them. I'll tell you a little bit of my assumption of where we kind of landed on those things. On the plus side, what we did get was instilling in the law the concept that actually some AI systems are too harmful to be used, and some, I would say, partial prohibitions on some of the worst uses of AI systems. And many of those case studies were in law enforcement. So we had a partial and very subpar prohibition on biometric surveillance in public spaces. That's the live facial recognition prohibition. We had a partial prohibition on predictive policing. Biometric categorization was covered to some extent there, a partial ban on emotion recognition, and a few others. What we did get there was instilling in some way that actually this idea that some AI systems are too harmful to be used, and that will be, I think, a thoroughfare throughout this panel. We also got a framework also of individual information. So there is something in the AI Act which says that if you are impacted by a high-risk AI system, the deployer of that system has to let you know. They have to inform you that, and you also have to be able to seek an explanation, which is a slight expansion of the legal text of the GDPR. So there are some positive things. We also got the obligation of AI deployers and companies developing of a duty to register high-risk systems into a public database. So instead of researchers, academics, civil society, engaging for years, doing freedom of information requests, maybe many of you have been doing that already, to try and understand what AI is even being used on us, there is some level of public transparency and public information potentially out there in this framework. These are the good things. The bad things, in many cases, those prohibitions are either extremely partial. Edry and others have argued that the facial recognition ban creates a roadmap to biometric mass surveillance and actually enables mass surveillance. The predictive policing ban in many ways is not particularly enforceable and wouldn't prohibit especially place-based predictive policing systems, but generally many systems that are using sort of predictions to profile people on the basis of whether they or not they will commit crime in the future. The emotion recognition ban does not explicitly doesn't cover migration and policing. So there are many carve-outs in actually what is banned and what isn't. Equally, this whole concept of transparency, whether it's individual or public, is completely carved out for specific uses in the areas of policing and migration. I won't go any further into the details of what that text is, but just a few learnings on that. I think we learned a few things, some about activism and some about just how to legislate on many of these issues, which are social issues, right? They are about technology indeed, but they are social issues. I think one thing I personally learned is that, like, when we saw the carve-outs for law enforcement, when we saw the carve-outs for national security, what essentially we saw is that the EU created a framework that enabled surveillance, and specifically discriminatory surveillance, particularly refusing to restrict some of the most harmful manifestations of racialized surveillance. So refusing to ban specific AI cases in the migration context, refusing to properly and meaningfully ban predictive policing and mass surveillance, when we know those types of systems are disproportionately used on migrants and racialized communities. So essentially what we learned there politically is that the EU is in very much creating an enabling framework for mass surveillance, discriminatory surveillance, but also politically the broader idea that we should have more resources, more money, more tools to police, to prisons, to detention centers, to a punitive and carceral framework that polices people, surveils people, and criminalizes people. That's one thing we learned politically. On a lighter side, one thing I think we learned more practically and in terms of organizing is that the way we achieved what we did achieve, which I just said wasn't very much, but it was quite something, was through collective action, through civil society trying as best as we could to mobilize together, to trying to eradicate this idea that there are digital rights experts and then there are others. So LGBT communities, migrants' rights communities, racial justice communities, all of us are civil society, and we do need to mobilize on these issues together. It's not that you have a digital rights community and these are those experts to be touching on technology regulation. Actually, we need a broad base of people if we're going to achieve anything. So that's the second learning, and I'll pass on there.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So very much a mixed bag, leaning on the negative for the AI Act is what I'm hearing from you. Security carve-outs, I mean, they were more or less a signature of the last commission. I think we had the same with the European Media Freedom Act. But now, sorry, Joanna. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. There's a lot that's going on, and it will depend partly on enforcement. But I don't want to say it's only leaning on the negative. I think the positives were amazing, and that the question is, of course, enforcement.
Yeah.
But we do have a lot more access to what people will be doing, and we hopefully can improve it. And when I said boring, I didn't mean to exclude the really important work you guys did on the excluded systems, incidentally.
Yeah, to be discussed in the open conversation. Now, Daniel from Access Now, I think this is the flow is quite good in that you're going to talk about the AI Act as it pertains to conflict. Just a brief word on Daniel. So again, Daniel is someone you will all know quite well. He is now an authority on the AI Act and was front and centre representing the interests of civil society together with Sarah and others. Daniel is based in Brussels, is the Emerging Technologies Policy Lead at Access Now, an NGO with a global presence that defends and extends the digital rights of people and communities at risk. In the past, Daniel was a Mozilla Fellow and has a PhD in philosophy from KU Leuven. For his fellowship, he developed the website AImyths.org to debunk myths and reframe narratives about AI. Daniel is now going to address AI and conflict and its lessons for AI governance. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the invitation and happy to be here. And as Mark discovered after we had spoken online and then met in person, I'm actually Irish despite the German surname. So in case you're confused about the accent. Just following from what Sarah said, I just want to first address what's happening in Gaza and to also say that Access Now had previously been a moral supporter of CPDP, and because of the involvement of the Haifa Centre, we withdrew that moral supportership, and thankfully the Haifa Centre was also, the partnership was discontinued. But I just want to say that Access Now condemns the ongoing atrocities in Gaza, the physical and digital occupation and oppression of Palestine, the atrocious violation of rights, an unprecedented level of murderous bombing. In unprecedented times like these, where international law is so flagrantly violated by governments and companies, we cannot do business as usual. It's not just about Gaza, but it's about the core of human rights. It's about the core of our democracies. This requires solidarity across the board. And as Sarah said, ensuring that the people who are in our spaces are held to the standards of respecting human rights. I reiterate Access Now's call for an immediate digital and physical ceasefire and call on governments and companies to stop aiding and abetting genocide. I think, Sarah and Joanna have given me a fantastic basis to talk about this, but what's been very interesting, and horrific about what's been happening over the past few months there with artificial intelligence is that we're seeing how vital these calls for prohibitions are. When EDRI and Access Now and Article 19 and others started talking about prohibitions years ago, we were once called European privacy extremists. And actually, at CPDP, I think it was last year, I was on a panel about facial recognition, and someone from a prominent EU body spoke before me and said something like, I'll just say, the EDPS and the EDPB have come out and said, called for a ban on the things that we were also calling for a ban on, but they said that previous statements, previous positions on this were ideological. Our position was not ideological. It was based on an analysis of data protection law, of human rights law. And as Mark said, the conditions for calling for bans on things, when the use of AI systems is incompatible with human rights, when risks cannot be mitigated, when these systems undermine the core of our democracies, as these mass surveillance systems do, as predictive policing does, they have to be banned. And, we're often seen as coming into the conversation and saying, no, you can't do certain things with technology, but that's a very flawed way to look at what's happening. The systems that are being developed, the technologies that are being developed, the infrastructures are enabling new things. They're undermining safeguards that existed already. And we actually need to be proactive and not take the status quo, which is a developing status quo, as a given, but rather look at every moment, reassess things. A good example of this is CCTV. When CCTV cameras were installed, it was not possible to immediately analyze the footage and do mass surveillance with them. There was a friction in terms of how much effort it took to go through that. We need to reevaluate these things constantly as technology develops. But just to give you an overview of what has been happening with AI in Gaza, because I think a lot of people don't know, and I think it really emphasizes how important the bans that we've been calling for are. Very briefly, because there's a lot. 972 magazine, an Israeli magazine, did some incredible investigative journalism and exposed that a system was being used called the Gospel. The Gospel system was used to determine infrastructure targets, but not infrastructure targets in terms of, where are Hamas holding weapons, where are their bases, etc., but infrastructure targets designed to cause, damage to morale. So blowing up a mosque, blowing up a university, this type of stuff, actually using machine learning to try to calculate things like that. Then another investigation came out which exposed two more systems, one called Lavender and one called Where is Daddy? Lavender is, often when we're talking about AI in warfare, people think about robots, killer robots, this type of stuff, lethal autonomous weapons, but I think this is like a different type of system which I would call something like automated target generation. The Lavender system essentially, from what we know, gives a score between 1 to 10 for everyone in Palestine in their likelihood of being a Hamas militant. Apparently at its peak, and the parameters can be adjusted, it had generated 37,000 people as legitimate targets. It's also aimed at low-level operatives. The Israeli military already has information on high-level targets. They actually wanted more targets. And this is important because I was talking to someone who knows someone in the Ukraine military who's also working with AI, and it's diametrically opposed to how Ukraine is using AI for target generation. In the Ukrainian situation, they have a limited number of arms, and too many targets, and it's about a triage of targets. How can we find the best, most effective targets? Israel does not have a limitation on resources. It's actually looking for more targets. And this is I'll go into in a minute about what I think is actually going on here. But you have this lavender system, so it generates targets of people to go with. You then have a system called Where is Daddy, which is utilizing the already existing biometric surveillance infrastructure, other forms of tracking to determine when one of those targets is in their family home, and the family home is then bombed, including the people who are in there, which is often more than the people who actually live there because people are sheltering together. This is, and I've said it publicly, I think I have a very good dystopian imagination, and I never anticipated something as horrific as this. It's the worst possible thing I could have imagined someone doing with AI. Now, again, it's very important how we frame what's going on. And, this goes back to like when we had the discussions about whether or not to ban remote biometric identification, these type of systems. There was always this thing of, do you criticize the fact that it's biased? Yes, that is a problem, but you shouldn't just be perfecting an instrument of surveillance, because what that system is being used for, it actually working perfectly, is in complete opposition to human rights. It's the same with this lavender system. Some people have focused on the fact that apparently the military were only taking 20 seconds to approve a target. So apparently all they were doing was checking if the target was male or female. If it was male, the target was approved. If not, it wasn't. So if you focus on things like that, what will the response be? Okay, we'll take a minute. That is not what we want. We don't want systems like this to just be improved, to be made a little bit more human rights compliant. That system is being used to provide a spurious veneer of algorithmic objectivity to a campaign of mass murder. They want to bomb. They're essentially carpet bombing, and this system is just providing a spurious justification for that. It's also really important that that system is built upon layers of other systems and infrastructures that we have been calling for bans on. The biometric surveillance infrastructure, all of that surveillance is necessary to turn into this system. It doesn't come out of nowhere. And if we don't have the databases, if we don't have the metadata, if we don't have all of these things that as digital rights activists, human rights activists were calling for the abolition of, it makes it much harder for a system like this to be spun up in times of conflict. So I think seeing how those systems are used there should give us more urgency in being, I don't want to use the word extreme, but just being, strict in our demands about what is and is not allowed, because we constantly see room for exceptions, room for national security exceptions. We can use it in these one or two situations, but that leaves the infrastructure there, and then we'll always have this slippery slope. Thanks.
Daniel, thanks very much. I think you bring up a very important point, and there isn't within the human rights, digital rights community enough discussion about the normalization of AI systems and their use in conflict. And I think there was an FT, very quickly just to make a point, there was an FT investigation a couple of weeks ago, and it's become clear that defense tech is now being more normalized, not only by big tech, but also European-based firms who are also complicit, but also within the VC environment. So there was a time when defense tech wasn't really part or wasn't accepted as a normal investment. It now is. So that really is quite worrying, and I think it's incumbent upon us as digital rights organizations to make sure that this is discussed and that the Commission and other bodies really are allowed and discussed this so that something can be done to make sure there's proper regulatory control of it. In any case, lastly but not leastly, and certainly I think it's very relevant because it's the UN, the UN can obviously help shape this global governance, and how is the question I'm going to ask Anna Oosterlink. Anna is our head at Article 19 of UN Advocacy and based in London. Prior to Article 19, Anna served as a senior political advisor at the Permanent Mission of Belgium to the UN, New York, and was the humanitarian affairs and human rights expert at the UN panel of experts on South Sudan, appointed by the UN Secretary General at the time and reporting to the UNSC. She also worked for Save the Children UK and was on peacekeeping finance at the UN Secretariat in New York. Anna.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for having me here. I'm going to change tack a little bit because I'm a UN expert. I'm not a technical expert, and I'm definitely not an EU expert. So I think whether you agree with the usefulness of a global AI governance framework, we already have a multitude of initiatives that are happening by a multitude of UN and state actors, although at a much, much higher level than the EU AI Act. There are too many to mention, but think, for example, about the UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of AI, as Joanna mentioned, and the ITU's AI for Good Summit, which is happening next week in Geneva. That's on the UN side. From the state perspective, the US led a resolution on AI governance at the UN General Assembly in April. And currently in New York, states are negotiating a China-led resolution on capacity building for AI. So there is a push for some sort of global governance framework, or at least elements thereof, at the UN level. There is, by the way, also a General Assembly resolution where all member states committed to not using digital technologies that cannot be operated in compliance with international human rights law. Now, this is a non-binding commitment because it's a General Assembly resolution, but it should have some strong moral value nevertheless, and sort of picking up to the points of the previous panelists. Now, I would like to focus on one particular initiative that you may have heard of that could prove to be impactful, at least to some extent. The Summit of the Future will take place in September 2024 and is billed as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address gaps in global governance. Member states have decided that there will be 3 outcome documents: an overarching pact for the future, a global digital compact, and a declaration on future generations. There's also a high-level advisory body on AI, which brings together 32 experts from a variety of disciplines, from government, private sector, civil society, and academia. And when it started, the body said that given AI is an inherently international matter in nature, we need a global approach to a governance framework that respects human rights, that includes the voices of all, and is rooted in multi-stakeholder collaboration with the UN in a leading role. That gives you a little bit of insight into their thinking. Now, so far, they've issued one report in December 2023, and that said, and I quote, "This technology cries out for governance, not merely to address the challenges and risks, but to harness its potential in ways that leaves no one behind. And a key measure of success is the extent to which AI technologies can help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs." And this notion of how AI technologies could turbocharge the SDGs, where, as I'm sure you're aware, progress is lagging far behind, is really key for many UN member states, in particular the global majority. And it's a strong motivation for the UN to get involved in AI governance. Now, moving to the Global Digital Compact, where a lot of member states are focusing their attention to enhance international AI governance. The negotiations are still in a fairly early stage, so it's kind of hard to say where this is exactly going to land. But I can say that the current draft that came out last week has some interesting proposals on AI governance, which has its own chapter. It sees UN-level governance as complementary to other international, regional, national, and industry efforts. It wants to foster international cooperation on AI governance, and it wants to use AI to accelerate SDG progress. No surprise there. There are 3 specific functions that would emanate from the Global Digital Compact: horizon scanning of future implications through a scientific lens. Second, supporting compatibility of governance approaches and interoperability of standards. And third, capacity building. It proposes new mechanisms such as the scientific panel, think like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an annual policy dialogue, and a fund to invest in capacity building. So far, a lot of states are not really in the mood for new mechanisms at the UN level, so I'm not sure if this is going to happen or not. But what the current draft does not do is sufficiently protect the full human rights framework, including international human rights law, IHL, and international refugee law. It mentions multi-stakeholder approach, but it's not clear how that would work. There's no clarity on how these new mechanisms, if they get through, would interlink with existing UN mechanisms. There's no guidance for private sector actors involved at any time of the AI life cycle on how to implement, say, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And there's no distinction between the various AI technologies and their different impact. They just talk about AI as a general issue. So to conclude, just a few thoughts on whether the Global Digital Compact could serve as an effective global governance framework. And I think, honestly, the answer is mixed. because on the one hand, the UN obviously has unique legitimacy and convening power as the one body on earth with universal membership, founded on the universally agreed UN Charter, and it has been able, at times, to agree on norms that apply to all. But, on the other side, there's been lack of implementation and weak enforcement of those norms. Discussions easily get politicized, with member states having different viewpoints from anything from AI governance and human rights. Another possible impediment is the UN system itself. There is a bit of a turf war going on as to where AI governance should sit within the UN system. And when it comes to the Global Digital Compact specifically, member states say they want something ambitious, action-oriented, but also concise and appealing to the general public. But it needs to be agreed, I know, it needs to be agreed by consensus by all 193 member states. So there is a risk that existing commitments, say human rights, multi-stakeholderism, could get diluted or undermined. So I'm not really sure how much room there is for actual governance arrangement and how much teeth the compact will have to enforce these. But I'm really interested to hear what people in this room think about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anna. From that, I am sensing you don't think the UN is the appropriate forum for a global governance framework. We now have 15 minutes to discuss amongst ourselves before going to the audience. I think, Joanna, I'm going to bring you in with either a direct question or your own comments, which I suspect is going to be the latter.
If you want to tell me your question, I can incorporate that into what I was going to say. I do actually have notes, yeah.
Yeah, no, go ahead with the notes.
Okay. All right, so I really want to, I didn't do what everybody else did because I was worried about getting through 30 slides. But thank you so much for having me here. And it's interesting to have the different perspectives. The reason I'm worried about the UN is because, bluntly, as I mentioned, the U.S. has, in the G7, Germany nominated me to the Global Partnership for AI, which is a G7 thing, although extended with India, and we were stopped from doing anything. So the U.S. came into it under the condition that we would not be normative, right? What does that even mean? Well, what it means is not like the EU, where if you say that this is a rule, then everybody has to sign up to it. But then the people in charge of GPay distorted that to say that we couldn't make any recommendations about governance. And it was just like, what is this institution even for? And so when I look at the Kyoto thing, when I look at this, as you mentioned, the UN thing, it's not just that they treat AI as a single gestalt. They specifically treat it as if generative AI, for which there's no business case yet, right? They've made $1 billion, they've spent $15 billion, right? So that's all they want the conversation about. And the harms that we heard about, what are happening in Israel and what's happened with elections all over the world, are not things that were particularly, generative AI isn't making that much a difference in how much disinformation is actually out there, right? The main thing that's happening is actually search and surveillance and finding articles in leading newspapers that are congruent with, say, Moscow's perspective, and they amplify respected news. They don't have to go and make, fake news. So we're seeing, and I want to give an example from history. So I was in one of these rooms, literally in the basement in New York, with, at that time, Russia and China and the U.S., and a number of other, 2 more AI experts, a couple of large companies, unusually, in the room. And all the discussion about the killer robots took most of the 3 days. And we couldn't have the kinds of conversations that Daniel just did such an eloquent job of explaining that we should have been having. And people were really angry about it, but they're just, nobody in a military wants a lethal autonomous weapons system. They know that the people that get killed is them. You don't want some runaway system right by your own soldiers, right? It's friendly fire only by machines. So it's like a really, we haven't been paying enough attention to the right things because people have done regulatory interference. Sometimes, these are my friends. People, for very good reasons, were very worried about lethal autonomous weapon systems. It's not even clear to me how much in their own heads they realized what they were doing. So this is why I worry sometimes that we do need to celebrate. And I want to come back again to lavender. I mentioned my deep concern about replacing humans with machines because of whistleblowing, because of the importance of how we protect each other. But with lavender, what I hope will happen, what I think is happening is exactly what you said, that they're trying to create this veneer for excusing. They could, when you have 37,000 targets, you can choose any building you want to blow up for whatever reason, and then blow it up. And as you say, actually go around maximizing pain, emotional pain, right? But hopefully no one will buy that excuse. I mean, if you look at, we have a couple of precedents, both in Germany and in Canada, where airline companies tried to say, oh, you know, the AI just did that. And the judges had none of it. They immediately said, no, it is not an independent entity. It is an extension of your capital. This is your company doing this. And I hope that they get slammed down in ICC if they even try to say, oh, no, we had evidence that there was a terrorist there, right? Because we know the level of what was happening, and that, as you said, there was plenty of other targets. There's all kinds of other things they could have done. So it cannot be allowed to be a veneer. So.
Thanks, John.
Sure.
Did anyone else have anything they'd like to respond to, Joanna?
Or anybody else?
Well, then, Sarah, I'm going to use my privilege to ask you a direct question, but more related to your work you're now doing. So how do you think we might build AI frameworks that center marginalized communities, or other ways AI systems fit into the broader forms of structural oppression?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I was reflecting a little bit about, like, okay, taking a step back from the AI Act, what if we're trying to draw some lessons for the future, for other AI governance or AI regulations, even better, what would that look like in general, but also specifically embedding this concept of understanding structural racism, understanding AI as a tool of colonialism, as Daniel has mentioned. How would that even look? Some things I think we tried to push for but didn't get in the AI Act, and other things I think we didn't even think of at that time. I think the first thing, to Joanna's point, is that it has to be binding. If we were spending time on any type of legislation to regulate AI or any type of technology, the power framework that exists in the dominance of big tech requires us to be working on binding frameworks. If we're not, then I think we have to ask ourselves, what's the point? I think there's no such thing as AI ethics, and so we really need to move beyond this idea that, like, these high-level groups or these recommendation frameworks are useful in the face of sort of this vast sort of misuse of, which is essentially dominance and capital. And if we're not challenging that, if we're not making specific legal frameworks for that, I think we have to admit that things are not going to go anywhere. So the first thing is, I think we really need to think about how to have a clear legal framework, have binding rules, and always, first of all, embed this concept of what to do and not to do. So how can the legal system that we're trying to create, prevent harm, prohibit certain types of use cases, certain types of development, but also uses of AI? That has to be central to any AI framework that we're working on in the future. If we are not doing that, we have to accept that use cases that I have talked about, use cases that Daniel have talked about, will continue to be used. It will be, if it's profitable, it will be used for that. And we have to recognize that. The second thing is, we have to recognize also the power imbalance, as you said in your introduction, that AI sits within. It's not a magical technology that somehow eradicates all the structural oppression of history. That doesn't exist, that cannot exist. And so we have to view these technologies in a wider political and historical context. And any AI framework or any legal framework that looks to address technology has to take that position. It has to look at AI or technology in the context of a broader context of structural oppression, which will disproportionately harm marginalized communities, people under occupation, etc. I think one thing that we did push for, and I think we have some of in the AI Act, and we should try to build toward, is frameworks of more public information about what AI systems are used, not because they're AI, but because they are often using public resources, whether they're AI or not. We're constantly talking about the use of technology to decide where welfare benefits go, or for use in the military. All of these, in many cases, are public uses of resources. And so we need to always embed in our frameworks, how do we get as much information about those uses of resources, and also how can we embed systems of accountability. So if a government body is trying to use something like this, how do you embed sort of ways that the public can know about that, but also control that, can take part in that decision-making process. So public transparency and accountability has to be part of any future technological, I think, framework, AI-based framework that exists beyond the EU. A few things that I think we didn't achieve, but I think should be part of any future framework. Number one, we really need to focus on how to counter a growing securitization framework. The growing tendency of any new law that's coming out of the EU at least, but I think globally too, to enable more and more surveillance by security actors, whether they be police, governments more broadly, benefits agents, and also the military and national security agents. We need to recognize that digital law is in many ways being used to expand the security state. And if we're talking about protecting marginalized communities, this is one of the biggest threats to that. How do we contest that? If we want a human rights-based framework, we have to push back on that equation between securitization, safety, surveillance and safety. We have to push back on that. And lastly, one thing that I think really wasn't enough part of the discussions of the AI Act and should be, is this question of infrastructural control. Daniel talked about it with respect to military, but more broadly, when we invite AI systems in a context of big tech dominance, what we are into the public sector, what we are doing is opening the door to private sector control of what should be democratically controlled institutions. That is an infrastructural control. It's not only about disproportionate harms, it's not only about isolated incidents of discrimination, it is about who controls our public institutions and who doesn't. We have to push back on that. We have to push back on why governments will contract AI systems that are primarily often developed and also continue to be controlled in many ways by big tech and the private sector. Why spend so much money on these things to address social problems when actually there are many other solutions to social problems, especially when these tech solutions are not proven? And lastly, what's the extractivist aspect of it too? The AI Act did not fully reckon enough with the fact that AI systems involved a vast level of energy consumption, involve a vast level of resource extractivism, data centers requiring so much water consumption. We got a limited amount of information about that in the AI Act, but not enough, and that was not part of the conversation. So all of these things, from warfare to disproportionate impact on marginalized communities to infrastructural and economic exploitation, were really not enough part of this framework and any future sort of way to actually properly govern AI systems, not as a tech aspect, but as a social and economic and political problem, have to address those things too.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. A lot covered, a lot to be discussed yet. Unless there's any more comments from our panelists, I think we can open up to questions. So maybe a question, give your name, your affiliation, and who the question is for. So I think Frederica, your name went up. Your hand went up.
Yeah.
Is there a microphone?
There is. Sorry, excuse me. Thank you so much. I'm Frederica Kalteiner. I'm both independent and here for the AI Now Institute. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for all your work. We are not happy with, nobody is happy with the AI Act. Industry isn't, civil society isn't. But it was really beautiful to hear all the fruits of all the hard labor and the work that you have done. And we would be in a very different place without all of your work. So I just wanted to start with that. And then I have a question to Anna. So in the Global Digital Compact and the UN AI discussions, do you see any chance of pushing back against the narrative, which is completely ridiculous, that AI, which isn't even defined, will help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? Is it even useful to push back against that? That's my one question. And then the second one is, I'm really concerned about capacity building on the UN level in the absence of a definition of AI, because in the absence of a definition, AI means generative AI, And then capacity building risks, meaning subsidies for the handful of companies that are already dominant. What's your perspective on this? What are our odds of pushing back?
Maybe we just collect 2 or 3 more, and then we can go to the panelists.
Hello, my name is Andrietta. I'm from Liberty Global, but I'm asking more from a professional point of view as a former systems auditor. So this one is for Sarah and Daniel. I just want to know what your perspective is as the role of the courts in moving the ban that we're all seeking in the right direction. For instance, if you look at Bridges' case law, Welsh police, you look at the Proctorio case in the Netherlands with the Human Rights Institute, all of them have always positioned it as more what was wrong with this specific technology than the compatibility. The Russia European Court of Human Rights, Russia leaned a little bit into saying it's intrusive, but it appears that nobody wants to touch the compatibility with the fundamental rights specifically. They almost look at it as a technology question. This specific technology, was it biased? So in that light, I feel it goes back to the roadmap, enabling the roadmap. So I just want to hear your views on that.
And one more at the front here.
Hi, I'm Chantal Joris. I'm Senior Legal Officer with Article 19. I had a question around the use of AI in conflict, and specifically also linking it to the EU AI Act. So perhaps for Daniel or also Sarah. So do you see any protection that the EU AI Act could give to civilians outside the EU in conflict territories, be it, and this is coming from someone who really does not know the AI Act. So is there anything that will limit states or companies in the EU ability to deliver certain AI systems? You talked about the ban or partial ban of live facial recognition, which has been used in Gaza, for example. So I'd be curious if you think that there's anything that can protect civilians there.
Thank you, Chantal. Anna, to you first. Keep it as brief as you can, and then we can have another round. We have approximately 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you for that question. So I can be quite brief. So in terms of pushing back on the whole narrative on SDGs and AI technologies, which is seen as a monolith at the UN level, there's not a lot of diversification there or nuance. No, there is no point. It is a narrative that is very popular with a lot of the member states. And because obviously the SDGs are lagging so far behind, they feel like this is what we need to do AI. This is an issue where they can actually find agreement. And obviously, again, bearing in mind that we have 193 UN member states. So they feel like this is an area where they can find agreement in. So I don't see that going anywhere. A lot of the AI discussions at the UN are really hooked on the idea of progressing the SDGs. And then in terms of the capacity building, it's a little bit politicized. So in the current draft, there is a proposal for a fund to set up a fund. I think it's for, I have to check, $100 million, which would be to do AI or to fund AI skills capacity training. 100 million, yes. Financed by voluntary contributions from public, private, and philanthropic sources. It's all a bit wishy-washy. It's not entirely clear how this fund will be managed, who indeed will be contributing to it, what will be done with it. So there's a lot of questions around this. But again, this is something, though, that is coming a question from the global majority countries that are saying, we need capacity, we need technology transfer, we need skills, we need data sharing, we need so many things. So again, that's something that I think will have some resonance and will be reflected to some extent in the GDC. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Joanna, did you want to quickly say something?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I wasn't supposed to be next. I just want, first of all, about this binding thing. The reason the UNESCO recommendation wasn't binding is because 4 countries blocked it. Russia, China, Singapore, and the UK. all right? And that was pretty weird. Of course, remember, US wasn't there, and UK and Singapore have obligations to it. I worry about these things being used to stall. So I get, you're right about definitions. If we don't say what definition it is, they're using it to do the Gen AI. But if you say, oh, we need to think of it, there's so many definitions out there. And I think this is why I really want to emphasize anything that is disrupting the EU going ahead and demonstrating. And so coming to this question about whether the EU AI Act can protect people outside of the EU, not legally, not directly, unless it maybe if it was like a European company, a company that was domiciled here. But the main thing that's happening, and it's not only the EU, Brazil and Australia, these companies that are making these things like the Digital Services Act are actually making the companies change, and we are getting more information out. So I really want to emphasize, this is almost a question back to Sarah, that when you're saying we need to know how the public governments are using our systems and our data, I thought that was one of the things we got with the AI Act. I think this is like the main thing we were trying to get, and it is there, right? So I think this is something, and I know because I'm working on these joint Berlin, New York things, that the American academics are celebrating the fact that the EU is now getting the data that the companies had told them couldn't possibly be generated. They can no longer say that because people care enough about doing work in business with the EU that they have reorganized themselves and are now exposing that data. So now they have more trouble turning down, Columbia and Harvard and whoever wants it. I don't mean to be, priming with the exclusive there.
Thanks, Joanna. To Andrietta's question, Sarah.
Yeah, before I come to your question, maybe just a little bit, we do have, the AI Act does give more data and creates more bureaucracy for the use of high-risk systems. But first of all, high-risk systems is a very limited list of systems. You can go, is it still Annex 3? It's still Annex 3. You can go there to the list, and those are the types of systems that you get public information for.
It's pretty much everything the government does, though, right? Education, anything that changes affects your outcomes.
Well, no, because if you look at, it's not the headings. So indeed, the headings are education, employment, but you still have to, for a system to be high risk, you still have to show that you're having one of the uses in the subheadings. So showing that it's, profiling, screening applications for jobs and stuff like that. And they're quite, there's many there, but they're quite narrowly construed. That's one thing. So it's a specific list. Back in the day, the commission was saying the high risk list is about 10 to 15% of all AI applications. I don't know where they pulled this number from, but it gives you an idea of it's some AI systems. Secondly, law enforcement, migration, carve-out. So indeed we have public information, but we don't have public information about when the police does anything with use of AI or when migration control authorities. You're looking at who does that affect. So indeed it's nice to have information about how a private company is using job screening applications. That's important, that's great. But what about when they're using a system to assess your visa application? What about when they're using predictive analytics to see when people are illegally crossing the border? None of those things are high risk. Some of those things are high risk, but none of them are included in the public transparency measures. So we don't have that public information. We're just back to square one with all of that. There is a hierarchy of how the AI Act deals with some systems and others, and you can directly map that to a hierarchy of who should have digital rights or not, according to the EU legislator. Andreata, to your question, I think for me that maybe Daniel, you also want to comment on that, but I think on the facial recognition ban, there is a space not just with courts, but more broadly to advocate for at national level stronger prohibitions. As you've said, that this is essentially telling states how to do mass surveillance, how to use facial recognition, and under what conditions. There is a role, and I think many civil society are going to be pushing for strategies on how to actually push on the national level for a stronger ban on facial recognition and other uses in the public space. On the other bans, I think very much as you say, there's a lot of work to be done at the court. So lots of the prohibitions are vague. They're either vague or they have specific exceptions. One I would like to say is the social scoring prohibition, for example. You see in the Siri court decisions back before the AI Act, the two arguments that were used in that in that challenge were both non-discrimination law and privacy law. And they actually struck down Siri, so that one of the sort of welfare fraud risk assessment algorithms, on the basis of privacy law, so data protection. They're using too much data that they didn't have consent for and using it from one area to another. The court didn't go for the disproportionate use of that system on single mothers, on people of color, on migrant communities. I think the role of the courts in measuring all of the bans, litigating all of these bans, is actually trying to take as wide a wider net as possible in terms of which rights are violated. So using existing data protection law, but also using the AI Act to say these systems, widely construing those bans as much as possible. So there are a lot of texts that are quite vague in the biometric categorization ban. There's a limited list of discriminations that biometric categorization can do. Predictive policing ban is deliberately very narrowly construed, and I think there's a way to interpret that to incorporate more predictive policing systems in this. For me, that's one role of the courts, is actually recognizing, okay, this is the text of the law. There are vague words here and there, and so these are the harms that we also want to incorporate in that, and that they will be the challenges. States will, in some ways, maybe see, okay, we shouldn't use predictive policing because of the EU Act, and some might try it because of the way that the text is formulated. And I think it's the role of the courts there to have as wide a conception of human rights as possible and a harm reduction sort of approach. But you might want to add on that.
Very quickly, Dan, because then we can go to the last question, then another round.
Just two quick anecdotes. I gave a lecture to first-year students on the AI Act a while ago, and I talked about all the failings of the bans and stuff, and one student, just this amazing question, from someone so outside, was like, isn't it a bit of a problem that you were asking governments to regulate themselves? And it is an issue, and that is the roadblock that we came up against in the trilogues, was that the council just said, no, you're not getting these bans, you're not getting that. And it reminded me of when we had the EDRI Reclaim Your Face campaign, and we globalized that into the Ban Biometric Surveillance campaign. And when we talked to civil society organizations from other regions, they were like, what you've done in Europe is great, but you're asking the government, and that won't work in our jurisdiction. So we have much broader recommendations there to the courts, to companies, and everyone thinks that we're going to see a much more right-wing Parliament, and the EU is going in a bad direction. So I think we're going to have to take lessons here from other jurisdictions where we haven't been able to rely on the government to legislate for human rights, looking at, investor advocacy, looking at going through the courts, all of these things to make these bans and to operationalize our rights. So that's definitely going to be, unfortunately, a growing thing that we'll have to lean into.
To Chantal's question.
It doesn't. So on the protection outside the EU, the AI Act really regulates the placing on the market, systems that are placed on the market in the EU. So we did, and so it's not directly going to, control what happens outside the EU. I mean, that said, there's indirect ways. We know that if a company has a system on the market in the EU, but also elsewhere, we will have information about it that could be potentially useful, but it's indirect.
If I could just say very quickly on so people from Africa were saying, this is colonialism. Why are you trying to regulate our AI? I've been on panels where people are saying that, and we aren't. We are only defending our own citizens, and that is our legal obligation under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have to do this. And if there are knock-on effects, that's a decision within the other jurisdictions. But it's important. It's not like an accident this is true. We are there to regulate our own countries, right? That's what the EU is for.
I think the big question here, and with the Israel-EU links, both ways, I think what we, as Daniel said, a thing to focus on is if a company is based in the EU, we have and is exporting systems elsewhere. The Act isn't covered, but we have to, number one, look at what information we can get about the deployments or development in the EU. But I also think there's a political issue there. If something is banned here, a predictive policing system is banned here, facial recognition is banned here, why should we have vast databases of people in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. Why? And so I think it's not necessarily a legal protection, no way, and that we pushed for that, and that was completely rejected. But it is definitely a political link that we need to be making, and that's, I think, a challenge to EU-centric advocacy.
Yeah,
Why only do EU-centric advocacy?
I completely agree. I think the difficulty is that the EU is, as you say, it's political and not united. So that it'll be interesting to see if we can manage to do something. We're coming into lunch, so we could probably stay another 5-10 minutes if anyone would be interested in that, and we can have another proper round of questions. Is everyone okay with that? Okay, so next round of questions. Hans.
Or if you want to go for lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the very interesting panel. I'm the Deputy Chief Privacy Officer of the Ministry of Defense in the Netherlands, and I listened to your, how to put it, statements quite closely. I'm wondering, we are fighting, I can say that out loud, with the questions how to integrate AI in military use in the Netherlands, in the European Union, but also within NATO. What we see is that China, North Korea, Russia are massively incorporating AI in their military, assets. We have to be able to defend ourselves against those threats. How are we going to do that in line with human rights law? Because I think that is the main question that we have and that we are trying to answer. And the answer cannot be that we just wait until we get overthrown by AI in the military of our opponents.
Okay, next question. I'll throw a hand in the far corner. And please direct your question at one of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Halit Kayhan, K11, Center for IT and IPLO. First of all, thanks a lot, Daniel and Sarah, for starting your words with the genocide in Gaza. I think that's absolutely very, very valuable. And I was thinking something just said by my colleague there. So we see this securitization in the EU and all around the world, unfortunately, in my opinion, unfortunately, because we are talking about human rights, and human rights will probably soon mean nothing, I'm afraid. I'm a bit pessimistic, most probably, but then do you think that, because we just heard that, what will happen if some other countries are doing some investment to defend themselves? So do you think that we are going towards a point of no return, where my pessimistic comment might be concretized? And if so, or if partially that might be the case, do you think that we may need to have some different starting points, talking points, strategies, not only based on human rights, but some other points of reference points as well, or strategies? So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Sure. Who'd like to take the first one?
Yeah. So as I already said a little bit before, actually, as much as the fundamental rights are something that we all feel is deeply moral and ethically important, it is also strategic to care about humans and their well-being. I mean, the U.S. says that it believes that all the laws that they've put into their military procedures are part of the reason and the U.S. has a lot of friendly fire. They make a lot of mistakes. But they really think that all the stuff that they're trying to do with respect to with constraining their AI is part of the strength of their military organization. I mean, Putin said years ago that, you guys, you say humans in the loop, we don't do that. Our tanks are just, there is no such tank existed, right? We have not seen these fully automated tanks running around doing things. It's just a bluff. So I understand the concerns, but a lot of the things, I heard the conservatives in Germany saying like, China, they have these drones where they come around and they don't, Google doesn't do face rec, so we don't have the best quality face rec, but China has their best quality face rec, and then they use it and they shoot you right through the heart. I had 2 different CDU guys say the same, like everything the same of this statement. It's like, we could have told where the heart is from the face using 1980s technology. You do not need like the bleeding edge. So I don't mean to diminish this, but everything I've heard has never led me to think that we need to compromise on the human rights. It really is a system of trying to protect people. And it does seem to, I don't think it really, I can see why bureaucracy can slow down decisions. So I have heard people talk about just the lost lives because you couldn't get the warrant fast enough, and then human trafficking people were gone by the time you got there. So I get that sometimes you do lose opportunities because the system is slow. But I haven't heard technological explanations really being slowed down. Yeah.
Okay, maybe just the last question, then we can wrap up.
Yeah, I think the 2 questions are related, and I think we've seen this throughout the EU AI Act. We must be able to do X because China does X. We must be able to do X because criminals do X. There's a slippery slope to a place that I don't really want to go. And I think the counter question, and to your question over there, is like, there are inherently other political questions that we need to be asking here. It's not just about tech governance. It's about, why do we want to spend billions on these systems that you haven't even proved work or do any good, when people in your country are homeless, people cannot eat, they are in in-work poverty? Why do you want this? Where else could we spend those resources? What else could we imagine?
I mean, I think Sarah summed it up well there, but as well, like, there are certain decisions. I think it's often not so much about AI. I think we need this nuance. There's this thing of, they have AI, we need AI, and then what is justified under that umbrella is a completely disparate consortium of technologies, and it's always been possible to develop one thing and not another. I mean, there's, infrastructural hardware levels, but just because country A does this thing, we have to do that. And I think what I really wanted to convey with my description of the target generation systems in Israel is that the use of AI is completely beside the point. It's being used as a justification for something that they wanted to do, and it's just convenient. That system is not enabling them to do anything. It's just giving them a justification for something they already wanted to do, which is essentially carpet bombing. So there's no technological sophistication there.
Final word to Anna.
Yeah, just to echo Joanna's point about human rights, that it's ultimately about protecting humans, and that's in everyone's interest. That's also in China's interest, in North Korea, etc. Although maybe, but to some extent. And I think as civil society, we need to keep talking about this. So there are existing human rights commitments that countries have signed up to, and we need to keep repeating that. The other thing, just from the UN perspective, is there is some political sway that, for example, the US, UK, and others can use to look at some of these things, and they can use that more. And so perhaps maybe it's useful for us to push more at that level as well, which we're trying to do through the discussion around the Global Digital Compact.
Okay, my final word is that even though this all sounded very sobering, I think this is the start of the kind of conversations that need to be had. And on that note, just to thank our fantastic panelists, thank you very much.